Right. Good evening, brothers and sisters, all those who've joined us on Zoom and those here tonight. Our lecture tonight, we're going to look at the book of Ruth and the books of 1 and 2 Samuel. It's a very new experience for me to deal with such a huge chunk of the Bible in one lecture, but we'll see how it goes. So, starting off with the book of Ruth. It's quite a jarring when you read the Bible and you come across this book. You have the sweeping sagas of Genesis and Exodus and the comings and goings and the stories of war and Joshua and the book of Judges. And then you hit this small little 4-chapter book, which has a love story. And then immediately we are thrown back into the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, again, the sweeping epic stories. So we have to ask ourselves the question, why? There's got to be a deeper meaning. Why does the Bible have this huge change of tone for a small, short little book and then back to the big, long, sweeping history books? One of the reasons, and many things we can look at, we can't cover it all tonight, but we can look at there are definitely deeper meanings in this book. There's definitely deeper things for us to see and for us to take a look at the book of Ruth. I've got more or less my complete sermon notes, so you'll be able to download them, but I won't be able to cover every point as we take a look at the book of Ruth. Now, it's got 4 chapters, and they're roughly some of the themes divided in each chapter. You've got love's resolve in chapter 1, love's response, love's request, and love's reward. So it's sort of laid out. Love's resolve, it's sort of dedication, what I want to do. This is what it is. The response of how that is responded to and what it requests, and finally the reward in the end. Other themes we can look at this book is prophecy as a pattern. We often think that prophecy is something that's prophesied and later on it's fulfilled. And that is a very simple, very simplistic way to look at prophecy. Prophecy is a pattern in the Bible. It comes around again and again. It goes in cycles. It starts all the way in the book of Genesis, and it keeps repeating itself in cycles and eventually until the end of the end times. Jesus as our kinsman redeemer. And what is a kinsman redeemer? It's covered in the book of Ruth. And Jesus as the Lord of the harvest. What does it mean in the story? Because there are patterns of love, there are patterns of harvest time, there's patterns of a kinsman. By the way, the word kin is just an old-fashioned word for family, right? A family redeemer, the harvest time. What does that mean? Because Jesus used these symbols too in the New Testament. All right, the names of the meanings, I'm not going to go into it. I think tonight we've got a lot to cover, but it's in the notes. You can take a look at these are some of the characters and what their names mean. Boaz. After Ruth, the next important character in the story is Boaz, and his name means strength. And even one of the pillars in the first temple, one of the pillars was named Boaz. So he's quite an important person throughout the Jewish faith and understanding. Right, like David's father, Jesse, Ruth and her family, they lived in Bethlehem. There were people who came from the area of Bethlehem. And they moved to Moab on the other side. I think I did put a map in. All right, so you can take a look there at the bottom. We can see Bethlehem is just south of Jerusalem. I know it's not on that map, but it's just south of Jerusalem, where you see the star there, and then you can see the old kingdom of Moab on the other side of the Dead Sea. Just to give people an idea with a bit of geography. And her sons took Gentile wives. Though they were Jews, they moved to the kingdom of Moab. Their sons took Gentile wives. And of course, that brings with all the implications of the mixed faith families. And both of the sons died. And Naomi is left with her two daughter-in-laws, these three women. And in the old times, especially in times like that, it's a very difficult position to be left in. They really didn't have anyone to care and look after them. Their options those days as women were limited, to say the least. So she plans, Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, plans to return to Israel, to her homeland. Understandable. And she gives her two daughters a choice. You can come with me or you can stay with these people. It's up to you. And Ruth decides to go back. She joins her mother-in-law and they go back to Israel. So it's difficult. She's a foreigner now in the land of Israel. She's a Gentile like you and I. We are not Jewish people. We are Gentiles. So there's this Gentile woman coming to Israel. And it is not difficult. It is very difficult for them. So what they do, it's quite understandable, is they started to, in order to try and scratch a living, they started gleaning. Now, it was like the welfare system of ancient Israel. If you harvested your field, even if you were the owner, you harvested your field, you and your workers were allowed to go over it once. And then the poor people were allowed to come in and pick up what has been dropped and fallen. It's called the gleanings. It was like their welfare system, so the poor would have something, they wouldn't starve. And it is used in the Bible as part of God's cycles of salvation. If we go into the New Testament and when Jesus spoke about the harvest and so forth, it's part of it. Not to get too technical, but think of it like the tribulation, those who are saved in the tribulation, the gleanings. It's often used when people get into complicated things. So here were these two Gentile women gleaning. The field is also an analogy for the world. When the Bible speaks about the field, it speaks about the world. Jesus used it a lot in his parables. When he's talking about the field, he's talking about the world. Boaz is introduced to Ruth by an unnamed servant. Sometimes that's used in the Bible as an analogy for the Holy Spirit. I can't give examples. Unfortunately, we have to move on. But she sees Boaz. And Ruth's nature also invokes similar compliments to the one Mary gets in the New Testament. And Boaz sees Ruth. The man and the woman see each other. Old story, folks. The established man and the woman who comes from humble beginnings. Right? Even in modern fairy tales, the Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast, all those things rotate around that. It's part of the cycles. The man and the woman see each other. He's established and she's young and attractive. Boaz treats her kindly. Ruth then goes home to tell Naomi about this man, Boaz. Now, Naomi recognizes him as a relation, and he can be a kinsman redeemer. Now, those days with the Israelites, they had lots of laws and systems about land. And land that was lost or land that was sold, especially if you were in debt and you sold your land, they had rules and laws how to get it back. And certain relatives could buy land back for you. There were quite involved, intricate rules that he is somebody who could restore Naomi's lands. Even though her husband had died and they had gone to a foreign country and they'd come back, she recognizes that this is a person who can, in fact, be like, let's use the word savior for them. He could save them from their difficult circumstance. He could get their land back. He could marry Ruth. So she recognizes this. This is a thing I can help. We can help our situation. We can recover from our difficult situation. Now, in order to be a kinsman redeemer, in order for someone to qualify, first of all, they must be kin or family. They have to be someone of relation. He couldn't be just another citizen of the country to Naomi. He had to be related to her. He must be able to perform, I suppose, especially from a financial situation. He must have the ability to do the purchase and so forth. He must be willing. As we get later into the story, as we read in the further chapters, he had to be willing to perform the action. You couldn't be forced. You couldn't go to your uncle and say, you have to buy my farm back. He has to be willing to do it. And he must assume all the responsibilities that come with it. And that is also how Boaz foreshadows Jesus as part of it. Boaz is also represented as the Lord of the harvest. He has authority over the reapers. That's a strong New Testament analogy for ministers and ministering, the Lord of the harvest. Now, brothers and sisters, those days, the people they were not blessed with the modern farming techniques we have. They didn't have irrigation the way we have. There's no electricity to pump water to the farms and so forth and so on. And harvest time was far more important than it is today. You got basically one shot. You had your growing season, your planting season, your reaping season. And you had to get it right. And you had to get your barns and your storehouses filled to get you through winter. And they were short on, they never had really, I think they had like salt for preservation and that. So what you don't want in a country, especially in a smaller kingdom like Israel, is pieces of your harvest to go missing, to be stolen, things to end up on the black market and sold at ridiculous prices, so forth, so on. So they would appoint someone Lord of the harvest, who would oversee the thing for the country and would make sure that things are reaped and the stuff goes to the right storehouses and that people get their fair share, like, for instance, the gleanings, that people are allowed to do things like that because it was necessary for the survival of the country those days. So the Lord of the harvest would be appointed every year. And they never messed around, and we can understand this person was in a position of trust. This person, the country was appointing him so they could survive. It's quite understandable. And it makes an authority and a good analogy for Jesus and for us who have ministries. Jesus spoke about the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Boaz here represents Jesus, Naomi represents Israel, and Ruth represents the Gentiles. So we start to form the picture. Boaz is a type of Christ. Naomi is a type of Israel, as a type of the Jews. Ruth is a type of the Gentiles. Naomi's plan reflects a part of God's plan. Her plan, she says, I want to get you to marry this man so that you can be saved, you can have a future, your future can be secured. Redemption of the land is a huge part of salvation in Judaism. They very much have a here and now understanding of salvation and the land, and to this day, the issue of Israel. Naomi's plan to secure God's future is extension of God's grace to the Gentiles. Ruth approaches Boaz on the threshing room floor. The threshing of wheat and the separating of the chaff is a powerful and frightening analogy of judgment. We hear it in the Bible about in the end times, God will separate the chaff from the wheat. God, Jesus, and the prophets spoke to them like that because it was something they understood, separating wheat from the chaff. Now, we can understand she comes to him on the threshing room floor. Boaz is sleeping. He would be doing that right after the harvest in order to protect the country's valuable investment. It was necessary. You would understand the Lord of the harvest sleeping there. And there would probably be men who worked for him and a lot of armed men and so forth to protect this harvest. He also teaches us about his character. He's a man who took his responsibility seriously, like with Gideon in the story in the book of Judges. We see similar behavior because they were trying to protect the harvest. Now, I'm not going to go into the sort of half funny thing, but just to say that any verse which says a man wakes up in the middle of the night and just sees a woman and then doesn't make anything else is not being creative, right? They're just covering the thing matter of fact. It shows you the story is not made up. Now, when Ruth goes in there and wakes him up, she asks to be covered with his cloak. The Old King James calls it a skirt. She asked to be covered with his cloak like a servant. She says, cover me. That outer garment, sometimes also called the mantle that he would have worn and covered himself with when he slept. Those days, it was the part of your clothes which carried your authority. It carried your rank. It's the part that David cut off Saul's cloak. We'll discuss that now when we get to Samuel. It's that part. He cut off Saul's cloak. He cut off the part which carried his rank. It's the part of Jesus' hem where the woman with the issue of blood touched. She asked to be covered by his authority, in a sense. She asked to be covered even though he is a Jew and she is a Gentile. In Ezekiel 16, verse 8, God speaks about spreading his skirt over Israel to cover their nakedness, to cover their shame. So a lot of powerful analogy in that one, to be asked to be covered by his cloak. The problem now, and then the meeting was very successful, by the way, and he decided to help her. He even let her sneak out in early morning before anyone woke up. He didn't want people to see her coming out of his chamber. It's understandable. Today, in modern parlance, we speak about the walk of shame. We don't need to go into that, but he didn't want her seen, and he agreed now to help. But there's a problem, is that there's a nearer kinsman. There's a closer relation. Now, Boaz is also on the local council. So we're talking about quite a person. He was Lord of the Harvest. He was on the local council. So, I mean, he was quite a person. We understand he had quite high rank in Israel. He must have been known in several communities. So he goes to represent her on the local council. He goes to act as a lawyer or as an advocate, whatever word you want to use. So here we have a Gentile woman with a Jewish lawyer, a Jewish advocate, and he represents her on the council. The nearer kinsman removes his shoe. I can just say to her that's part of the Levitical laws. You can read it in the book of Leviticus. It's normally a mark of shame, but they did it, it was done in a very happy mood. And he allows Boaz to act as her kinsman redeemer. He loads her up, the Bible says, with 6 measures of barley and grain in Ruth 3, verse 18. That relates a lot to Genesis chapter 1. I just want to say it's an understanding in Judaism that giving over 6 measures of grain or barley basically means I'm not going to rest till I've solved your problem. It's got a connection to Genesis chapter 1, and it's something that they know in Judaism. It's a declaration. I will not rest until I've solved this problem and put this job down. It can also be seen as a symbol of fertility, and indeed there were children, and the line continued. Boaz purchased the land for Naomi and takes Ruth as a Gentile bride. So here we have the Jewish woman gets her land, and the Gentile woman gets included in the covenant. Now in Ruth verse 4, I'm not going to worry about the first point, but in Ruth 4 verse 12, the book of Ruth gives us the genealogy. I've just increased the size of Boaz so we can see how it goes down from Perez down to David. It's 10 generations in all. And it's just an interesting thing that it says there in Deuteronomy 23, verse 7. If you read that verse, it speaks about nobody who is of illegitimate birth, so no one whose parents were not married, can enter God's sanctuary. Not even to the 10th generation. And it's just interesting that Judah got the blessing of the firstborn. They said from Judah's tribe will come the Messiah. I'm not going to go through all that in Genesis now. And King David is 10 generations from Judah. And when he asked to build God's temple, he was said no. And Solomon, who was the 11th generation, was allowed to build the temple. It's just an interesting thing. And also, Judah's sin was to fail to provide a kinsman redeemer for his daughter-in-law Tamar. It's the same thing. It's interesting. But yeah, Naomi provides a kinsman redeemer for Ruth. Judah failed to do that. So let's go back to all the big themes in this little book, this tiny little 4-chapter book that is sandwiched between these big, heavy-hitting books. Naomi had to be exiled in order to be redeemed. You can't be redeemed unless you're in a lot of trouble. And that is a huge theme with the Jews. Redemption. Exile to Egypt, redemption. Exile to Babylon, redemption. The diaspora by the Roman Empire scattered throughout the world, returned in 1948. The Jewish woman is redeemed. What the law could not provide for Naomi, what she could not get from the law, Boaz's love for Ruth got it. What the law could not provide, love and grace provided. Naomi was not welcome back when she first arrived because she came from an enemy nation. There was a terrible relation between the Moabites and the Israelites. Ruth does not replace Naomi. The church does not replace the Jews. The church does not replace Israel. There was salvation and a place for both women. Here's an interesting one. Ruth learns of Boaz through Naomi. Gentiles learn of Jesus through the Jewish writers of the New Testament. We have learned of the Messiah. But Naomi meets Boaz through Ruth. Because she doesn't get to meet him right until the end of the story. It's through Ruth that she meets him. No matter how much Boaz desired Ruth, Ruth had to approach him. God's word says, my desire for my people is strong, but we have to approach God. Especially from the Gentiles. We have to approach God. We have to respond. We have to come to God. Boaz became Ruth's kinsman redeemer and advocate, even though she is a Gentile. That Jesus is our kinsman redeemer. Jesus is our redeemer and our defender before God, even though we are Gentiles. There are 7 Gentile brides in the Bible, but none of their deaths are recorded. That's interesting. Some of the Jewish brides, their deaths are recorded. None of the Gentile brides. This Bible doesn't record their deaths. It's our hope as Gentiles. The book of Ruth is read by the Jews on Pentecost every year, which is part of the harvest. Pentecost is part of the harvest. And the Jews read this book every year on Pentecost, the strange little 4-chapter love story. Okay, and there's just a quick breakdown of the Gentile brides of the Bible. And Rahab, you see, was before Ruth. They're the Gentile brides, and none of their deaths are recorded. So I don't know if I went through that one a little quicker than I expected. No, that's almost on time. Yeah. So now we're on to Samuel 1 and 2, which to do that in a half an hour is really criminal, brothers and sisters, but I'll give it a go. We don't know who wrote these 2 books. The Jews, by the way, the Jews, this is one book for them. They put it together. We as Christians have broken into 2 books, but it's all the same writing. Nothing added, nothing changed. We don't know who the author is, but we think there's a combination of Samuel himself wrote the books, the prophet Nathan, Gad, and quite possibly others. He could not have written all the books because the book records his death. I've never read anyone who wrote a memoir and then I died and then they buried me and then I went to heaven. I don't know anyone who wrote like that. But he's probably wrote some of it, and there was probably quite a few prophets who wrote it. As I said, the 2 books are actually one book, but they're treated as such by the Jews. The events recorded span a period of approximately 100 years from 1100 BC to 1000 BC. So quite far back in history. In other words, 1,000 years before Jesus was born, before the rise of the Babylonian Empire. So it's far back in history. This is Iron Age. This is all the late. It's after the late Bronze Age, Iron Age. The date the books were actually written down is placed here about 960 BC. The purpose of writing these books is to record the history of Israel in the land of Canaan as they moved from the rule of judges until the rule of kings. When we are in the book of Judges, we're still very much there. But this is how the story evolved, how they found a monarchy and started now a more unified, more stable nation. But it was not really God's plan. Samuel was the last judge of Israel, and he lived to anoint the first two kings of Israel, Saul and David. So we have the 1 Samuel is roughly divided into two parts. So there from about 1 to 2 is the life of Samuel, and the second part of book 1 is the life of Saul. Now it starts with the miraculous birth of Samuel after his mother's earnest prayer. She prayed for a son, and when she got a son miraculously, and that's no coincidence, we are supposed to draw inference from that. She released him to serve in the temple. And he served as a young boy in the temple. And we should know the story from Sunday school. I remember it too. I was in St. Anne's, and the first time I heard the story was from a nun. So I remember that as a small child. And he kept hearing his name in the middle of the night. And he went and he kept waking up the high priest. And said, "Yes, why did you call me?" And after about the third time, the priest said, "No, I think you must, someone else is calling you, my boy. I think you must say, 'Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.'" So as a young child, and very interesting, his first prophecy as a young child was judgment on the corrupt priesthood. Because it wasn't just the political leadership, the priestly class got into it too those days. There was a lot of corruption going on with the temple worship and helping yourself and defrauding and that. It seems to me that we're always struggling in societies. We can speak about ancient times, we can speak about modern times. We're always going to battle with that one. Until we get the rule of the Messiah, brothers and sisters, we're always going to get trouble with that one. In the early part of the books, the Israelites would go to war with the Philistines. And they warred with the Philistines until King David finally conquered it for once and for all, the Philistines. And during the course of it, they managed to lose the Ark of the Covenant. That the Philistines take it away. To chronically and horribly summarize that, they kept trying to put it in the temple of Dagon, and the idol of Dagon kept falling down until it broke pieces. And I hope you remember from Sunday school, they decided to test. So they put it on a cart with 2 oxen, which had calves. And they said, well, if the oxen go back to their calves, then we know it's nothing special. But if the oxen are forced to carry this thing back to Israel, we know there's something supernatural. And as the story unfolds, the oxen carry the cart. Now, with the loss of the thing, in the meantime, Israel had to contend with a huge shock, to say the least, involving at least one woman giving birth prematurely and one old man falling over and breaking his neck. Just to say just the least of things, it was a shock. And then one day they were working in the fields and in the southern area of Judea, and when they opened their eyes, the ark just literally almost coming back by itself. So it's quite a thing. It was quite a story. It was quite an upheaval that it virtually came back by itself, pulled on a cart with 2 oxen. And Samuel then called Israel to repentance. He said, well, now will you people listen? But despite it, You know, a human being is a thing with a short memory, brothers and sisters. And despite that, what do? They go and they ask Samuel, we want a king like the other nations. Now, brothers and sisters, I've done a whole sermon. As a matter of fact, I think it was my second sermon when I first joined this church, was on the people demand a king. I can still remember the name of that. And God gives word to Samuel and he lays out, this is what your king will do. And you can make a whole sermon on that one half a chapter, because he starts off and he lays how sin destroys our life. He starts off on the small things and he finishes, and then he will be the king's slave. And the people insist. The people carry on. So to chronically summarize that, to criminally summarize that, he lays out the consequences, but the people persist. So they pick Saul. And of course they picked Saul because he was righteous and he was upstanding and he had a wonderful reputation. No. They pick him because he was good looking and tall. Wonderful criteria. Of course, we always pick up political leaders and how tall they are on our stand. Now, initially Saul enjoyed some success. But he began to make a series of missteps, like many of the kings. Now, again, to chronically summarize, to absolutely now do criminal cutting short of the Bible until God rejected him. And the Bible said God sent an evil spirit to drive him mad. And he was there being tormented. In the meantime, Samuel went to Bethlehem to anoint King David as the king of Israel. So he goes to Bethlehem, he finds David and anoints him. And exactly the opposite, he finds the smallest one of Jesse's sons. Bible did say he was ruddy and handsome looking, but still the people couldn't believe this, the king of Israel. Private joke, I thought it was funny in the one Bible movie, they used Leonard Nimoy to play Samuel. It's the only time I've seen him without acting in a blue shirt. And I was just so cross because he said, Lord, this boy, the king of Israel, I was waiting for him to say it's not logical. But no, kudos to you if you catch the point. But they pick him as the king of Israel. And soon thereafter, David becomes a national hero by slaying Goliath. So he goes, he takes the 5 stones and he slays Goliath, who was intimidating the armies of Israel. And he becomes a national hero. So he is taken into Saul's court, plays his harp. I left out the S, sorry about that. Marries Saul's daughter, befriends Saul's son, Jonathan, and he's enjoying a good life and he's rising to success. But as David enjoys more and more success, Saul becomes more and more envious of him. And it goes on and on until Saul throws, hopefully we remember the story, throws the spear at his head, misses him in a room, and David has to run away. And now to put this in a sentence, and to go over, I don't know how many chapters, I'm sure qualifies as some kind of sin, but he drives him away and generally chases him the whole countryside full. And there is issues with priests and showbread and someone's wife, and it goes on. I really, brothers, the story it's criminally hard. And by the end of Samuel, the book of 1 Samuel, Samuel has died. Saul is a broken man who goes to consult a witch on the eve of battle. Now, Samuel 2 begins with David receiving news of Saul and Jonathan's death in battle. That he receives the news that Jonathan and Saul have died. The famous expression he used, how the mighty have fallen. We still hear that one today. He says, strong as lions and swift as eagles, together in life, together in death. But that, I'm sure many have heard the expression, how the mighty have fallen. Although one of Saul's sons were crowned king, he is soon murdered. Then throws the nation in chaos, and the people ask David to become a king. Now, David, again, he moves, he starts off in Hebron, and he moves from Hebron to Jerusalem. He moves the ark into Jerusalem, just to say that David, in stages, his kingship, he built it in stages. He moved into Judea, became crowned king of Judea. He started a family. Then he conquered Jerusalem, and he made that the capital of Israel. Jerusalem had been for generations a thorn in Israel's side, that they had never conquered it. From the time Joshua came to the land, there was a problem. They could never take this area called Jerusalem. It was sort of like an abscess. And David conquered it. So he builds his reputation piece by piece. He then moves the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. Again, it's a story. The first time when he set out, God struck, I forgot the name. Excuse me. God struck someone dead for touching the ark. And, sorry? Isaiah, sorry, man. God struck him dead for touching the ark. And then David first was angry. He went back. He changed his dress. He put on an ephod. He walked barefoot. He led the people in a procession, and he brought the ark into Jerusalem. And then he celebrated and so forth. Then David finally, as time goes on, plans to build the first temple, but is stopped by God. We actually just saw a little clue in the book of Ruth why. He was stopped by God. But God made promises to David. He says he would have a son to succeed him, unlike Saul, who was not succeeded. David's son would build the temple, not him. David's lineage would be established forever. His ancestors would go on forever. And God would never take his mercy from David's house. So he has made certain promises. Now, to build up Israel in David's vision, it's not enough for him to take over Israel. It was a small kingdom in a very difficult time. David waged a military campaign on the surrounding nations, a very bloody military campaign. Yeah. All right, the military campaign. Okay, very quickly. Starts with the Philistines. He goes around in anti-clockwise. Starts with the Philistines, moves on to Edom, then to Moab, hits a speed bump with the Ammonites. The small kingdom of Ammon is almost, they flank the Arameans, nearly flanking, but they managed to hold on. But the capital city of Ammon will not surrender. So King David goes back to Jerusalem. He's on the roof. He's sitting looking, and Bathsheba. So, of course, he falls into sin. And like many sins, the problem is not the sin. The problem becomes the cover-up. And he ends up murdering. He tries first to get the husband, Uriah the Hittite, to come home, that he can sleep with his wife and they can hide the paternity of the child. Uriah won't do it. He won't go home because his comrades are on the battle line. He won't sleep in the comfort of his own home because he probably feels, and he's quite right, that's dishonorable. And David, in the end, murders him with a dirty military maneuver, leaving him in the front line, and 70 other men are killed. So God brings the prophet Nathan to convict him. And Prophet Nathan does it very expertly by getting him to pass judgment on an anonymous case. And then in the end reveals you've just passed judgment on yourself. So he very nicely does it. Actually, it's quite expert, and it's quite a good technique. Anyone who does investigations and interviewing and interrogating people, it's a good technique. So David repents, and he returns. He is called back to the front line. And they are able to finish the campaign, and he can return home. But the problem is now trouble arrives in David's household. As things start progressing, they should be enjoying a time of peace. They've got the whole kingdom, all the borders secure. Indeed, it says in the book of Kings, we'll cover next week, it says Solomon had peace on all sides because David had built this huge buffer zone, and might get into it some more. It conquered the mines, the copper mines of the Edomites and the overland trade routes between Asia and Egypt they had taken control of, and so forth. And they should have a time of peace, but trouble arrives in his own house. His son Amnon, not to be confused with the kingdom of Ammon, Amnon rapes his sister Tamar. And then Absalom goes and murders his brother for revenge, kills Amnon. And at no stage does David take the correct action. He doesn't discipline anyone. He tries to always forgive. And the net result is he had a rogue, Absalom, on his hands. And he got the people to rebel. And they started a civil war in Israel, so bad that King David had to flee the capital of Jerusalem. Now, what's quarter past? All right. Briefly, I've done a whole sermon on 2 Samuel chapter 15. 2 Samuel chapter 15, if you ever put it next to Luke 23 in the New Testament, it's the story of David fleeing Jerusalem and going up the Mount of Olives. And it is very uncanny how it hits certain beats in Luke 23. It's almost like a foreshadowing. You see, as Jesus was taken to the place of crucifixion, it starts with a woman following, and you get the woman following King David. Then it goes on and speaks about when he reaches the top. Jesus, when he came near, they mocked him. And then you see when David reaches near the summit of the Mount of Olives, that a man comes to mock him. It's also described that near the summit, not on the summit, it speaks about in 2 Samuel 15, the place where they used to worship. There's believed to be a site there called the altar of the red heifer, where the Jews performed their most sacred and their most intricate sacrifice to get the ashes of the red heifer. Sorry, we don't have time for it tonight, but it's a wonderful to look at it, look it up, to research the sacrifice of the red heifer. Red heifers, okay, pure red bovines disappeared in the 7th century out of the gene pool. You didn't get them until about 2004. They started to appear in Israel and the United States of America. They just rejoined the gene pool. And we don't know. The Jews first spoke about it a lot, and over the last few years, they've gone very silent. Some people suggested that they found one that was kosher, and they've got the ashes. Because without the ashes of a red heifer, you cannot lay down a tabernacle or build a temple. You have to use the ashes first to consecrate the ground. Whatever is unclean, whatever is not ritually pure, once you put the ashes on, that's the trump card. They say it's the most powerful thing in Judaism, and it's just amazing that they disappeared completely for like 1,000 something years. And after the year 2000, they've just reappeared in Israel and the United States. And now we get them again. It's all right as the Bible describes it. It says a red heifer without blemish. But if you go into Jewish tradition, they're insane. What the requirements for the red heifer, what it is to be kosher. It's mind-boggling. And what they go through, there's a young boy of 12 who has to do the slaughter and the sacrifice. Brothers and sisters, you've never heard more particular crazy things that they want for that. But he goes up, and then in 16, after Samuel 15, when he's fleeing Jerusalem, we suddenly see this whole gaggle of New Testament symbols. People come to supply him, and they give him bread, wine, donkey to ride on. King David riding a donkey. Jesus in that area rode a donkey, and they all shouted, "Son of David." So you just start slapping the foreshadowing, the symbolism on top of each other. The fact that the road he took, if you leave Jerusalem and go up the Mount of Olives, you're heading for Jericho. A man takes a journey from Jerusalem to Jericho. You could go on all night. The symbolism just comes. The Bible just hits with the symbolism as he's leaving Jerusalem. Now Absalom, the son, does horrible things in the sight of Israel. Thank you. It's a 10-minute warning. And he pitches a tent on the roof of the palace, and he brings David's concubines and wives to try and provoke David into a battle. But David is clever. and draws him out. And David had many veteran and experienced, well-trained men, and they defeat Absalom's men. And he's left hanging in a tree. It depends quite what version but as he flees, his neck is caught. He's hanging in a tree. It's almost like foreshadowing of Judas Iscariot. Sorry, I'm being asked to start a video. So there's almost a foreshadowing there as well. So he retakes the throne, but the thing is, it's a very tense and difficult situation to put the kingdom back together. There is an argument, a vicious argument between the factions. And it says there that the words of Judah were fiercer than the words of Israel. But for that reason, they got the kingdom, because David's tribe and the southern Judean kingdom, which was dominant in Israel, they shouted the other party down, and they were able to put the kingdom back together. The book wraps up with a few more mistakes. Unfortunately, King David kept making them to the end. And there's a 3-year famine in the land. King David takes a census. Where God says, do not count the people, and he counts the people. And then there is a terrible plague, but Bible says, but not in Jerusalem. But not in Jerusalem. So right till the end, it was a difficult affair. Yes, he was a man after God's own heart. No one denies that. But boy, he was difficult. If it was a flock of sheep, he'd be the black sheep of the flock. He'd still be part of the flock, but my goodness, brothers and sisters. When we look at next week, Kings and Chronicles, I believe it's Chronicles that actually records his life without fault. It doesn't record his sins. I think it's just to remind us he was still God's man. But he doesn't fit into the New Testament context. You can see why he was in the Old Testament. He really was a creature of the Old Testament. So that's where Samuel ends. We'll kick off next week with Kings, the very, very last stage of King David's life. Okay. Sorry to all the folks who watched and who listened for all the technical errors, but it's part of life, brothers and sisters. Is there any question or that, if we've got a few minutes left? Or is it just too much is enough information to absorb? Yeah, I know it's terrible to take these giant books and to condense them. Like that. I think it qualifies as some kind of sin. But maybe it's a good reminder how rich these books are and how we should break these up with teachings and really look at them in detail. There's wonderful things hidden in them. Wonderful things hidden in the scripture. Anything else, brothers and sisters? Yes, please. Hang on a sec, brothers, get your question as well. We can record the question and the answer. The Ark of the Covenant. Okay, under Moses, the Israelites built the Ark of the Covenant. It's basically a box. It would be half the size of this table, and they had 2 poles on each side to carry it. And they put the 10 Commandments and Aaron's rod and some manna that was taken from the Exodus. They put it in. And it was kept in the temple, or it was kept in the tabernacle. And it was formed part of the rituals. It was Israel's most sacred artifact, the Ark of the Covenant. And it's an interesting thing because they would sprinkle, sorry, I've got to stand in front of the camera. They would sprinkle lamb's blood every year on the Ark of the Covenant for forgiveness for sins. So it was very key. It was the most sacred thing in Israel. So it makes sense that if you were trying to build a nation and you wanted support, you would want the Ark of the Covenant brought into your capital. That's why he brought it in. But you can Google it. It's basically a gold-covered box with 2 gold angels on top. And it's been lost to history. I know your next question. Whatever happened to it? The Bible stopped making a record, and it was lost to history somewhere. In Judaism, the Jews in ancient times used it, and they would sprinkle blood over it for forgiveness of their sins. They believed that it carried the presence of God. They would also carry it in battle in front of the army sometimes. But they stopped the record, the Bible stopped speaking about it. It just goes quiet. And to this day, we don't know what has happened to it. Yes, brother. No, there's only one. Only one Ark of the Covenant. The Jews only had one temple at a time. Okay, brother. Yes. All right. Then, brothers and sisters, shall we pray?